Let's start. Right, I'm just going to move things around a bit. Yeah, okay.
Thank you very much. So,
Thank
ladies and
you.
gentlemen, Paula.
Thank you. So, hello. We've picked the perfect night for some ghost stories because it is definitely a dark and stormy night. So, what I'm going to do very much with my folklore hat on today is talk about some royal ghosts. But when I was planning this talk, things got a bit strange. Um, when you're going back as far as I'm going to be going back, and in one case, probably the best part of 2,000 years, it all seems very legendary. It's like telling fairy tales. But I didn't want the talk to be solely back in the past. And as I got into more modern times, it raised some other darker issues. So it's, although a lot of this is going to be kind of fairy tales, some of it gets very strange indeed as we get closer to the present day. So it's raining ghosts. That should work. Yeah, there's a ghost. Ghost with a crown on. So I'm starting with the Roman occupation and going up until the end of the 20. Well, actually, the closing date for this kind of depends on whether you believe in ghosts or not, and we'll see why as we go on. But there are a few things to think about when it comes to royal ghosts, particularly. And I think they occupy, even within the sort of historical ghost stories, they occupy a certain niche on their own because they've got a few characteristics that are peculiar to them. So the first one is they're recognizable. I don't know how many people there thought this was Anne Boleyn, but it's supposed to be Jane Seymour. I'm not convinced. It's not very much like anything. But they're recognizable. Important people from the time before we had cameras, really, they're the only people whose images survive because they have portraits, so we know who they are and where they are and who painted it. Ordinary people from the Tudor period, if there were any paintings of them, we probably wouldn't know who they were. They had to be notable. Royal ghosts have got associations with old buildings as well. So many royal palaces and other stately homes and grand buildings go back a long way, and they've got a documented history. So you can often infer if a ghost is sighted in a particular building, it enables you to work out who it might be. And that history is very much shared. So if I said Anne Boleyn to any of you, even if you're not history buffs, you probably know a little bit about it. You say, oh yeah, she was one of King Henry's wives and she got her head chopped off. So those stories are very much part of our heritage, and we might not know them in detail, but we know a little bit. So there's that kind of shared culture thing there. However, if you are looking at somewhere like Hampton Court Palace, and there's a report of a woman in Tudor dress drifting down one of the galleries, it can make us lazy. We can just think, okay, so this is a Tudor palace, it's a woman in a dress, so it's probably Anne Boleyn. But in this instance, just because a ghost might look like a duck and quite like a duck, it ain't always a historic duck. So we have to be careful not to use the history to infer things that aren't there, and to always look at the evidence rather than just saying, oh, right, it must be this person. So all of that out the way, let's get going with some proper ghost stories. So I'm going to take you back now to the Roman occupation of Britain, Iron Age Britain, and Epping Forest. Or if you're from around where I live, Epping Forest. So this is Amesbury Banks. It's the site of an Iron Age fort. As you can see, there's not a lot there, basically a hollow in the ground where it used to be. But it has a very famous ghost, and it is the woman in the chariot in the middle picture, Queen Boudica. The story is that she lived there. I don't know what evidence we have for that. The problem with anything to do with Boudica is that history is written by the victors. And the best account we've got of her story is written by the Roman historian Tacitus. So obviously he has an agenda. She is legendarily supposed to haunt this Iron Age hill fort where the Iceni were based, and they sallied forth to beat the Romans up. She was left in a bit of an unusual position when her husband died. So according to Tacitus, who is the closest historically account of the story, that this will have to take a deep breath because my Anglo-Latin or whatever it isn't very good. But Prasutagus, Boudica's husband, when the Romans invaded, the various tribes tried to keep their land as far as possible by setting up alliances with the Romans. So I'm not even going to try and pronounce his name again, but basically Boudica's husband said, okay, here's the deal. You leave me and the Iceni alone, and when I die, I will make the Roman emperor heir to my lands, providing the emperor shares it with my daughters. So my family are all right. You get something out of this as well. Everybody's happy. Then when never mind, that bloke, when he died, the Romans very much reneged on the deal. Because for him, it was actually quite a deferential act. It was sort of saying, I recognize the Romans have the right to rule in my lands. So, let's share. And the Romans said, nah, you're dead, mate. We don't care. So what we're going to do is we are going to take over your household. We are going to enslave your entire household, including your queen and your two daughters. And we're certainly not going to share the kingdom with the two daughters. Boudica protested and was flogged, very, very badly hurt by the Romans, who did worse things to her daughters. So Tacitus tells us, as a beginning, the Roman response to the king of the Iceni's death. Boudica was subjected to the lash and his daughters were violated. All the chief men of the Icenians were stripped of their family estates and the relatives of the king were treated as slaves. Impelled by this outrage and the dread of worse to come, for they'd now been reduced to the status of a Roman province, the Iceni flew to arms. And not only did they rebel against the Romans themselves, they incited other tribes, such as the Trilobantes, to do the same. So they were building a kind of head of steam, a snowball effect, to pull in a lot of the ancient British tribes against the Romans. The Romans were not happy about this. Boudica mounted in her chariot with her daughters, and she went on a diplomacy mission, basically. She approached every clan within a reasonable distance, and she delivered her protest. She said, I want the British to fight under a female captaincy. I want you to let me command this. I am avenging. I am not just a queen of glorious ancestry, but I embody my realm. And not only have I been beaten, my realm has been beaten. We've got to fight back. She also had issues around the heredity of the inheritance of the lands. By what the Romans did, and this is monstrously unfair, but I guess we can't judge things by today's standards. But what the Romans did by what they did to her daughters is they damaged their honor. These women were very unlikely to marry, produce heirs. So there wasn't going to be an Iceni royal family. It was a cynical, nasty, and brutal treatment by the Romans. But heaven, as Tacitus tells us, was on the side of the just. It was on the side of Boudica and her family and of the tribes that were working with her. So one legion who was around effectively planning to battle her to retake the lands by force had died. He doesn't tell us how that happened. The rest were kind of skulking around in their camps. They weren't waiting for orders, basically, not doing a lot. But Boudica, she was ready to attack. However, unfortunately, once the Romans actually got galvanized, she was doomed to failure. Around 80,000 Britons fell across the tribes that she had brought together to combat the Romans at a cost of about 400 Roman soldiers. So quite simply, the ancient Britons was just flattened by the Romans. Boudica, and I think this element of violence, of trauma will come up over and over again in these talks. But Boudica, at the end, knowing she'd lost, not wanting to fall into Roman hands, ate some poison berries and killed herself. So the story goes that she has stayed in the area and that she still haunts it and drives around in her chariot, maybe to defend it against the Romans, I don't know. There's a story also associated with Boudica that she is buried under King's Cross Station. There's no historical evidence for this at all, but as an aside, a couple of years ago now, I was sitting in the bar at the Royal Opera House. Yeah, I know. And this rather strange woman said, "Can I share your table?" So I'm like, "Yeah, okay." She said, "You do know where we are, don't you?" And well, yeah, but the Royal Opera House. She said, "No, no, no, no. This bit, this is Boadicea's house. It's where this is at. Where the heck she got this from, I've got no idea." But she was sort of saying, "Oh, we're right in where her house was." But legend certainly tells us that if she did have residence anywhere near London, it was in Epping Forest. It may have been in this Iron Age fort, but it's a story, and we're going back so far, I don't think we can prove or disprove it. Next one. William Rufus. This is not only a ghost story, but a story about some mystical visions, and I do like a good mystical vision. So this is William Rufus, who is a very odd-looking bloke. I hope this is just down to medieval artistry. And the New Forest, which was planted by William I, I think, and it was a royal hunting ground. And William II, William Rufus, loved to hunt, absolutely loved to hunt. That was his thing. So even after his death, and must be, oh, crumbs, about 1,000 years since his death, he still stays there. He still hunts. And he's there are a number of ghosts I'm going to talk about tonight that kind of came into being because of hunting accidents, and he's the first one. But the day before the accident, he had a very strange dream. So the king dreamt that he was lying in bed and a surgeon was letting blood. Now, in the medieval period, and actually relatively late in medical history, they seem to let blood for everything. There doesn't seem to be a lot that letting blood couldn't cure. And he dreamt that the blood, when the surgeon released it, floated up to heaven and blotted out the sun. It's such a strange dream. The king called on St. Mary for protection and found himself awake in his own bed perfectly well. He was so freaked out, though, that he called for his servants to bring a light and to sit with him till morning. And they watched with him until daylight. So far, so bad, but it got worse because as dawn broke, a foreign monk came in and told Robert Fitzharmon, who was one of the king's courtiers, that he also had a weird dream that night, that the king had come into a church and in a menacing and insolent gesture. So basically, it seems that the way that his courtiers and nobles perceived him was that this king was like to throw his weight around. He was quite arrogant. And he'd come into the church in the dream in his usual arrogant fashion. And he ripped down the crucifix. He grabbed the crucifix. And when the congregation remonstrated with him, he just laughed and bit the arms off it and tried to tear the leg. Very, very weird. But the image endured for a long time. But at length, the foot kicked out from the crucifix and kicked the king over. At that point, smoke poured out of the king's mouth and floated up until it touched the stars. Robert the monk thought, I probably ought to tell the king about this because this is just so strange and it sounds to me like an omen. So he came and he told the courtiers that this had happened. And William just laughed. He said, oh, he's a monk, you know. He's a monk and dreams for money like a monk. Give him a few shillings and don't get lost. Then he'd come up here to make trouble. But even so, although the chap was paid off and sent away, the king was troubled. And he said at the time, I wonder if I should go out to hunt today because all these omens are adding up and I'm feeling uncomfortable. And then you think, no, it's ridiculous. No, it's fine. I'm not going to miss out on a day's hunting. And off he went. So he went later in the day, sort of in the afternoon, and he was drunk when he went hunting. William of Malmesbury says, having plentifully regaled that day, he soothed his cares with a more than usual quantity of wine. Now, he may have made him careless. So after dinner, he went into the forest together with his friend Walter Tyrrell, who had been induced to come by France, to come from France for the king. And that man alone remained with him while all the other hunting party rode off. They were all employed in the chase while the king and Tyrrell were kind of hanging back for whatever reason. It was getting dark. Don't forget, they hadn't gone out until after dinner, which in this period was sort of served in the early afternoon. But by then it was getting towards dusk. And the king saw at a distance a stag and he shot at it, slightly wounded it, but the stag kept running. And the king and Walter took off after it. However, Walter then saw another stag. So he thought, well, while the king is looking after this one, I am going to try and get this other stag. But unknowingly and without power to prevent it, oh gracious God, says Malmesbury, it was so terrible. He missed the stag and pierced the king through the breast with the arrow. It was fairly obvious to William, what with this and all the omens, that he wasn't going to last very long. So he actually fell onto the arrow to try and hasten his own death. His body fell upon the wound, by which he accelerated his death, Walter ran up, but found him senseless and speechless, leaped upon his horse, escaped by spurring him to his utmost speed. But nobody was really that bothered. The king was not that well liked. And pretty much before he was cold, there was a cabal within the court to find a new king. However, a few of his countrymen did convey his body, which dripped blood all the way, apparently, to Winchester Cathedral for burial. And the tower within which it was buried fell within the year, and that was the end of all the bad omens. But it wasn't the end of William, because he didn't want, even in death, to miss out on the good hunt. So he's still there. He's still riding around the New Forest. He's still looking at those deer. There they are looking out for him. If you are remotely interested, there is a fabulous novel by, I think, Catherine Kurtz called Lammas Night. It is fantastic. And it takes as its central theme Margaret Murray's research on witchcraft, now discredited. And the idea of the king giving his blood for the land, and it starts with William Rufus. It's out of print if you can get hold of it. And it goes up from there up to World War II. And it's really, really good. So another aside. Right, let's leave the medieval period behind and get into the sort of late medieval, early modern. At this point, it's women in great frocks. And actually, much of the rest of this talk is women in great frocks. Anne Boleyn, she doesn't half get around, does Anne Boleyn. I'm never sure whether to put an E on the end or not, but I have in this instance. And I like this photo because of this portrait because of two things. First of all, she looks happy, and secondly, she's all in one piece, bless her. So, along with Dick Turpin, I think arguably the two of them, between them, are the most mobile ghosts in Britain. They haunt more places than anybody else, and Anne manages at least 4. I think there are rumours about the old West Ham ground as well, the bowling ground, because the family certainly owned land there. But these 4 all claim her. So Hever Castle to start with, top left hand. It was the family seat since the 15th century, so about 100 years before Anne's birth. And one of the rooms there is still known as Anne Boleyn's bedroom. Her ghost is said to return there from time to time, as it is to return to Rochford Hall at the other side of the screen there, where her ghost haunts the room said to be her old nursery. So with all of these, apart from the Tower of London, there's very much a connection with Anne as a young woman, as a child, before she met Henry, and before really she was anything more than the daughter of a significant courtier. Her father was a diplomat in the court of King Henry VIII. However, with Rochford Hall, the hall has been largely rebuilt since Anne's time. So although they have a room that they call Anne Boleyn's nursery, it's not very likely that she was actually living in that house at that time. Although we know from many ghost stories that ghosts can remain in locations even when the building's gone. Another place that claims to be her birthplace is Bickling Hall, which is in Norfolk. And this has associated ghosts, because not only does Anne turn up, but so does Anne's father. Anne's ghost, head in lap, is driven around the grounds by a headless coachman in a carriage drawn by headless horses. And this is a recurring theme. And it seems to be peculiarly English. Two things occur to me. One being rather irreverent is how the heck can anybody see where they're going? And the other one is, why are they horses and the coachman headless? Because they were never beheaded. Anne was. And I'll come back to that later. So the legend of her driving around in her carriage at Bickling Hall actually wasn't recorded before the 19th century. So it may be part of that explosion of Victorian interest in the past, in antiquarianism, and in what we would call now fake lore, possibly. There's certainly an element of 19th century romanticism. But on the subject of riding around on horses, her father, Sir Thomas, also rides around the grounds of Bickling Hall, also in a carriage, also with headless horses, although I don't think that his head is anywhere other than sitting on his ghostly shoulders. According to the Reverend E.S. Taylor, who contributed to Notes and Queries in 1850, Sir Thomas is believed by the vulgar, so there, to be doomed to drive his carriage over 12 bridges in the vicinity of Bickling Hall for 1,000 years from time to time to atone for his role in the death of his daughter. Now, what that role was really isn't clear. He certainly presented Anne at court as a diplomat, somebody that was reasonably close to the king. He would have an interest in Anne marrying Henry, because it would bring glory to the family. And indeed, by the time he died, he was a Knight of the Garter. But his actual contribution to her death, I think, couldn't have been anything more than incidental. Sir Thomas outlived Anne by 3 years. He was buried back at St. Peter's Church, Hever, quite close to Hever Castle, again the family seat. By then, he'd lost favour at court. And he had lost not only his daughter Anne and his political career, but also his son George. And George's story is very sad because everybody remembers Anne. She was vilified. I mean, she was portrayed to be a witch. She bewitched the king. She was some sort of weird monster almost. But George kind of found himself dragged into it without really doing anything. He visited his sister when she was married to Henry, and when Henry was thinking of a way to get rid of her and move on to wife number 3. And all he did was he spent some time alone talking to his sister, and that was enough for Henry and his sympathetic courtiers to say that Anne and her brother George were carrying on an incestuous relationship. On that basis, they were both executed. So it wasn't just Anne, it was George as well. Sorry, changing notes here. He executed him at the Tower of London 2 days before his sister. So Anne knew when she went to the scaffold that George had already been executed. Really nasty. I almost wonder why George isn't one of the ghosts as well, because he was in a way implicated more than Thomas. But I think the main reason is that on his death, while he was on the block waiting for the axe to fall, he professed his religious faith. And it may be perhaps that took him swiftly and smoothly onto the next life. Whereas Anne and her father, perhaps maybe they had more reason to doubt, maybe they're not as devout as George, and have kind of remained around. And Anne, you kind of get that feeling maybe she's still looking for something. She's wandering from place to place, looking for something, even if it's only rest. Sorry, I need to go back one. Assume I've gone back one, it's easier. Okay. Yeah, last viewed. So the last place I'm going to talk about is the Tower of London. There's a famous song, I don't know if you know, with the head tap underneath her arm. She walks the bloody tower, but she doesn't. Anne haunts 2 parts of the Tower of London. She haunts the White Tower, which is likely to be where she was imprisoned before she was beheaded, and she haunts Tower Green, where she was beheaded. So she doesn't haunt the bloody tower, but she haunts the White Tower, doesn't scan so well. And again, that's something that's kind of, I think, become part of the folklore because of the song, but it's not the part of the tower that she actually haunts. There's a story that a soldier on guard duty back in the 1860s saw Anne's ghost and was so terrified he deserted his post. More on that just now. She's not on her own. The Tower of London has long been a place of imprisonment and of royal imprisonment and of infighting and different parties competing for who's going to be running the country. As well as Anne haunting there, where, by the way, that soldier's account was accepted by his superiors. He could have been court-martialed for dereliction of duty. He was not. They accepted that he's seen a ghost and he was terrified. But as well as Anne, we have the 12-year-old Edward V and his younger brother, Richard of Shrewsbury, aged 9, known as the Princes in the Tower and believed to have been murdered by Richard III. Some bones were found, but it's never been conclusively established that it was these boys. And also the ghost of Lady Jane Grey, the so-called 9 Days Queen, although apparently the history says that she may have reigned for slightly longer than that. Extraordinarily tragic figure, and I'll talk more about Lady Jane when we get to her home very shortly. And Henry's habit for doing in his wives gives us some more ghosts at Hampton Court. Catherine Howard, another tragic figure, the other one that was beheaded, is said to run through a gallery at Hampton Court Palace, and she's actually reliving the last moments before she is dragged away to be imprisoned and executed. She's pleading for mercy from Henry, and one version of this story says that she runs down the corridor and bangs on the door at the end because she knows that the king is in up the other side, and I will speak to the king. I will talk to him. I will explain. I have done nothing. I am innocent. Please let me go. And nothing ever happened. Still there, running down that corridor screaming. She's a scary ghost. Jane Seymour was possibly the love of Henry's life, but maybe because she provided him with a son. And unfortunately died a few days later due to, as many women did in those days, due to complications and probably fever caused by the labour. She was known as a gentle and quiet woman in her lifetime, and as a ghost, she's the same. She is seen every year, apparently, on the anniversary of her son Edward's birth, going down the Silver Stick stairs, which are the stairs that lead up to the bedroom where she gave birth to Edward and was confined until her death. Her presence is a sad one. It's not scary. It wonders what might have happened if Jane had lived. It may be that Henry wouldn't have been seen as such a tyrant. It may be that he would have settled with Jane Seymour. Don't know. But it seems that he was more fond of her than all the others. But whether that was because of her sweet nature or because she gave him what he wanted in the form of a son and heir, we don't know. Returning to Lady Jane Grey, more grey frocks. This is the ruins of Bradgate Park in Newton Linford in Leicestershire, and this was the seat of the Grey family, and there's not a lot left now, as you can see. So Bradgate Park is now a public amenity, but it was originally the grounds of Bradgate House, otherwise known as Bradgate Hall. Lady Jane was believed to have been born there around about 1536. They don't have an exact birth date. She was implicated in a plot to crown her as queen, aged at only about 15 or 16. She was very young. She was also extremely clever, quite bookish, and not terribly keen on being pulled into anything. The idea really was to do two things. It was to guarantee the Protestant succession, keep Mary out, possibly, or to make sure that Mary's heirs didn't inherit. And it was also there to give power to the Dudley family, who were a powerful family anyway. And she was married to Lord Guildford Dudley. So she was married at 15. Jane did not want to be queen, and she said so. And she also said, okay, you have made me queen. I am not going to make my husband king. Only I can do that. As queen, I need to pronounce that as a law, if you like, or a ruling. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to give Dudley power. So she was not this little pushed about creature that history sometimes portrays her. She was like, okay, I don't want to do this, but if I am going to do it, I'm going to do it properly, and I'm not being told what to do. Once she was dragged in, though, things went from bad to worse pretty quickly. Once deposed, Jane was forced to witness the death of Guildford Dudley from the window of her room in the tower while she awaited her own execution. Once she saw him beheaded, wasn't long before she had her head on the block as well. And she's another mobile ghost. She's another ghost that haunts more than one location. So as well as haunting the Tower of London, she's seen headless, driving around Bradgate Park on New Year's Eve each year. And in common with Anne Boleyn's ghost at Bickling Hall, she's in a carriage drawn by headless horses with her head on her lap. And you can't help wondering whether these stories, I'm not sure I'm convinced by the actual, these ghosts actually appear, but the stories, there's a real conflation there of the elements crossing over. And you kind of wonder at what point that happened. And I blame the Victorians for everything, but I think there might be an element of that. I'm going to talk a bit more about headless ghosts, actually. I couldn't find a picture of a headless horse when I was looking quickly. Sorry, I need water. Why are they all headless? So I kind of get that somebody whose death was traumatic, who suffered death by beheading, may appear as a headless ghost. I get that. But why the horses in the carriage as well? And I think there's two reasons. One was advanced by Jennifer Westwood and Jacqueline Simpson in their Penguin Book of Ghosts. And they suggest that being headless was simply a euphemism for being dead. So a dead ghost in a carriage pulled by dead horses and driven by dead coachmen. But I'm wondering as well whether they might be kind of window dressing, because when the execution happened, it didn't involve a coach and horses. And I feel that maybe the presence of a headless coachman, the presence of headless horses, is emphasizing the fact that in this carriage, it's not just a fine ghost of a fine lady going out for a drive around her land. It's the ghost of a fine lady who suffered a cruel execution. So it may kind of underline and reinforce that message that she was executed and beheaded. Moving on to Windsor Castle. This was, okay, check-in time. Loads of them. So I've tried to keep it all in kind of historical order, but by the time I got to Windsor Castle, things had fallen apart. So the first ghost here is Queen Elizabeth I, and I love this painting of her. It's on the front of a biography of Elizabeth that I have as well. And I love it because so many pictures of her portray this kind of quite monstrous woman, massively overdressed, wearing most horrible. She used to whiten her skin with white lead, so she was slowly poisoning herself from the outside in. And I love this picture of her when she was a young girl. She's probably about 18, 19. And the story about her goes back to the First World War, 1918. A soldier was reading in the castle's library, and a woman just glided across the library, disappeared, and she was in Tudor dress. So he later found out that that part of the castle had been refurbished by Elizabeth during her reign, so there was every likelihood that she had used that room in that library. It seems that she occasionally returns, even now, to take a tour. And according to the Daily Mirror, she was also seen by two little girls at the castle, probably in the 1930s, and that would be Queen Elizabeth II and Princess Margaret when they were small children. George III was confined at Windsor during his periods of mental illness, and he couldn't do a lot. He was very much confined within the building, even not even in his, But what he liked to do was to stand at his window and look out over the River Thames. And if the soldiers on guard downstairs, out in the ground, saw him, they would always salute, and he would always wave back. And this was just something that the king really enjoyed doing. He liked that human contact. Many years after he died, a soldier on guard duty saw a deathly pale hand move aside the curtain, and this chap didn't stop running until he reached the east terrace on the other side of the castle and the safety of a fellow guardsman. So it seems that George might still be there looking for his view of the river. The most famous ghost, I think, associated with Windsor, and yes, I took this from Robin of Sherwood, because I found out about her through Robin of Sherwood. And I'm not one of those women of that generation. Yeah, we were all about Robin of Sherwood. And Herne is a fabulous story, and it's such a legend, and there's so many different versions of it. And he's not royal himself, but his role in royal history is quite significant. So there's a number of variations on the Herne the Hunter story. A commonly used one was put around by Harrison Ainsworth, who wrote a lot of adventure stories. He wrote Rookwood, which was about highwaymen, and he says that Herne was a huntsman for a king. Yeah. Which king? It gets really confusing. Different versions. Could be anything. Henry II gets put forward a lot. Even Elizabeth I sometimes. But Herne was out hunting with a king. When the monarch cornered a stag, there's a lot of it about. This is what did for William Rufus. But the stag attacked him. Or Herne got in the way and was himself provoked. Either way, the stag gored Herne. The king was so grateful that Herne had got in the way and he hadn't got bored himself that he made Herne a great favourite. Depending again on what version you believe, Herne was rushed back to the castle, given the absolute best medical attention and recovered from his injuries, or the devil popped up and said, I will save your life, but you will have to wear antlers for eternity. So you can take your pick. Either way, Herne became a royal favourite, and the other huntsmen didn't like this. Didn't like Herne being treated better than them and getting a lot of fuss made. So there was a lot of vicious gossip at court. And it was said that Herne had become slow, he was old, he was useless. And quite frankly, if Herne was one of his own hounds, he'd take him out and shoot him. Herne took this to heart and died. But after he died, his ghost returns to the ground, Windsor Great Park, where it is seen even now. And the reason why it's important, I think, is not just because he was a close associate of the monarch, but because he is a herald and still is. He is said to appear, or the sound of his hounds baying, or the sound of his hunting horn is heard when something significant and unpleasant is happening in England's history. So, for example, he has heralded the deaths of a number of kings, including George VI, and also appeared before the start of both the World Wars. So, like Francis Drake in another story, he is an omen. He's transcended the human and has really become a spirit of not only the place, but a spirit of England, a spirit of Albion. Glamis. Sorry, my headphones are falling off. Please excuse me. There we go. So not exactly a ghost, but a really strange story. And it's kind of turned into a ghost story. It didn't start as one. So this is the... So just keep an eye on the time. Okay. This is the childhood home of Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, and birthplace of Princess Margaret. And there's two spooky stories connected to it. The least well-known, perhaps, is the story of the page boy. And it's another story that has massive parallels with a story somewhere else. You get that so much with folklore. So the story is that a page boy, a little boy, was told to sit outside his mistress's room and await orders. It was winter. So he sat outside the room to await orders, and everybody forgot about him, and the poor little thing froze to death. And his ghost still returns and sits there and waits for orders. That's so sad. But there's a massive parallel between that and the story of Robert Nixon, the Cheshire Prophet. Robert Nixon was a man skilled in both foretelling the future and in eating. He liked his food, did Robert. And he wasn't a clever man. In fact, he was seen cruelly by some people in his village, which is over in Cheshire, as being a bit of a village idiot, which is, horrible but true. That's what they said about him. But the king, probably Richard III, had heard about his incredible talent for telling the future and said, "Bring him to see me. I want this man to come to court." And Nixon said, "I'm not going." He said, "If I go to court, I will starve to death." And his mother said, "You are ridiculous. The king's got all this amazing food and wine, and you're going to be so spoiled. But why would you not want to go?" He said, "No, I'm going to stop." Nonsense, you must go. So Nixon was persuaded. It was flattering. You were invited to London to meet the king. The problem was, Nixon was not the easiest man to get on with. In fact, he was pretty annoying. And when the king got a little bit bored with him, he kind of gravitated down to the kitchens because he could keep out the way of everybody and there was plenty of food. But two of the servants just got so fed up with him hanging around that they locked him in a storeroom and forgot about him. And poor Robert did eventually starve to death because by the time the king returned from a journey and said, "Where is my prophet? I've decided I want to talk to him again," he died. So quite similar. But the other story about Glamis is the famous one, and this is the one about the hidden room. So it's said that one more window can be counted on the outside of Glamis Castle than on the inside. And somebody went round once and hung handkerchiefs in the windows, and there was one window that didn't have a handkerchief. Or, if you prefer the other version of the story, there were 4 windows that didn't have a handkerchief. This story was first suggested by the novelist Sir Walter Scott, the idea of a hidden room, but the hidden inhabitant of that room came rather later. So according to the Smithsonian magazine, a contributor to Notes and Queries in 1908 says that there was some years before that, the heir to the earldom of, Strathmore, was born in the castle, but was born with significant birth deformities. And the family felt that he was not able to take on the role of Earl and to look after the land, look after the people. So he was quietly and discreetly shut up in a room and left to live his life there. And another member of the family inherited the land and the house and the titles. 2 people did discover him locked up, a doctor and a builder who was making changes to the building. Both were given money to be quiet, and the doctor was also encouraged to move overseas. So it looked like they were trying to hush something up. Now, it seems that if there was somebody locked in this hidden room, they probably died around about 1890, or certainly no later than the early 1900s. The house was let out in 1906, and it's unlikely that the family would have let the house to somebody else if the man had still been in residence. Lord Bowes-Lyon, 13th Earl of Strathmore, said, "If you could even guess the nature of this castle secret, you would get down on your knees and thank God it was not yours." And if that wasn't dark enough, we're going to start talking about very modern ghosts. And this is difficult territory, but I felt that I didn't want this all to be about Tudor ladies in gorgeous frocks. And Diana was very much about the cult of celebrity and about all sorts of ethical questions. So it was perhaps inevitable that such a high-profile individual that her death would lead to rumours of her coming back as a ghost. To me, I find it easier to tell tales of people that died, no matter how gruesomely, in 15 something than in 19 something or 20 something. I find that hard. But is it fair that these stories are being told when this person has living children? You know, it's nasty. But the whole issue of ethics or simple good manners hasn't stopped people from claiming to see Diana's ghost. And maybe if you want to be cynical about it, cashing in on it. Marina Hyde in The Guardian just 2 weeks ago, in response to Diana's ghost being a character in the last series of The Crown, where apparently she comes back and tells Charles how handsome he looked crying over her coffin. That's nasty, isn't it? Comes up with the following. So the first one was from the funeral of Queen Elizabeth II, which was on ITV. I missed this, I was watching the other side. And at some point during the commentary, a voice could be heard in the background saying the death is irreversible. The fact that she's trapped, strange. And some people said that was somebody talking about Diana. But we know about pareidolia. We know that people can mishear stuff if it's just in the background. I didn't hear the actual broadcast, so I can't say. Also, Diana did use psychics herself, and one of them, her energy healer, a woman called Simone Simmons, announced to the Daily Mail in August 2017 that the princess was still in touch. Mortem. Apparently, Diana was in favour of Kate Middleton and Brexit, but she didn't like Meghan. So in that way, she was pretty much a typical Daily Mail reader, if you believe this stuff. The leader of the controversial Japanese new religion, or cult, depending on which way you look at it, Happy Science, who've also channeled Margaret Thatcher. He channels all sorts of celebrities to promote his agenda. Wrote a book called Diana, Her Messages 20 Years After Her Death, and said that the princess had contacted him from beyond the grave to say that there would be a revolution and the monarchy would be overthrown. She also said she wasn't dead, and if she was dead, she wasn't a ghost. I can't work that one out at all. I don't want to end this talk on a low, so I'm going to throw in quite a nice little story that I picked up while I was doing the research. For the Queen's Diamond Jubilee, I don't know if anybody saw it, there was a very sweet little video of her having tea with Paddington Bear. And the footman in the video was Simon Barnaby from the TV series Ghosts. And he said that while they were filming, one of the Queen's courtiers told him that this was her favourite show. So this is the Queen's favourite ghosts. And goodness knows, she's probably seen enough of them to know which ones she likes best. I'm going to finish there. Thank you for your attention. And yeah, all done. Stop sharing, Paula. There we go. Hello.
Well, thank you so very much. That was very interesting.
Oh,
We don't
thanks.
often have stories of kings and queens and royalty. So that makes a change for us. Thank you very much. Just bear with me while I get the
Sure.
chat up.